The first time I heard her voice, I was elbow-deep in a tangle of coaxial cables beneath the communications console of HMS Blackwood, sweat beading along my temple despite the chill that seeped through the bulkheads like a slow, saline breath from the North Atlantic. It was the summer of 1942 June, to be precise, and we were running escort for Convoy PQ-17, that doomed procession of steel and hope bound for Archangel. Outside, the sea gnawed at the hull, with teeth of foam and ice. Inside, the ship thrummed with the low, metallic hum of diesel generators and the intermittent crackle of the WT set, tuned to 500 kilohertz, the international distress frequency. Always listening, always waiting. I remember the exact moment because my fingers had just tightened around the base of a faulty Type 22 intercom junction when her voice slipped through soft, true, unwavering, threading itself through the static like a needle of warmth through winter wool. It wasn't broadcast over the public address. It had leaked in through a misrouted auxiliary line from the forward sec, where Nurse Eleanor Whitmore had been stationed, since we'd taken on wounded from the Troubadour torpedoed off Bear Island 2 nights prior. Her singing was no performance, no grand aria. For morale, but something quieter, almost devotional. All through the night, the old Welsh lullaby, her contralto gliding over the groans of broken men like oil over troubled water. I should have reported the stray signal immediately. Standing orders from the Admiralty Naval Signal Instruction 1440 firsts were unequivocal. Unauthorized audio on internal channels constituted a security breach, however innocent. Intercom circuits were for damage control, not comfort. Still, I didn't reach for the cutoff switch. Instead, I held my breath and let the melody coil around my ribs, each note a reprieve from the mechanical monotony of code groups and cipher keys. The air in the comms cabin smelled of ozone, hot bakelite, and the faint, persistent damp of mildew, blooming in the seams of my uniform. Outside, a depth charge detonated in the distance, muffled thunder rolling through the keyland, yet her voice never faltered. It rose above the ships, creaks, and shudders, steady as a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. By the third night, the singing had become a ritual. Eleanor would begin just after 2,200 hours, once the morphine doses had taken hold and the worst of the fever dreams subsided. I'd adjust my headset, feigning signal checks while angling the gain on Channel B to catch every inflection, a slight tremor on the high notes, the way she softened consonants as if afraid to startle the silence. My logbook entries grew terser, almost mechanical. A deliberate camouflage 2,300 routine comes with escort group leader. No U-boat sightings. Weather worsening. Beneath the ink, my mind was compiling a different record. The cadence of her phrasing, the breath before the final verse, the silence that followed like a held sigh. Then came the order. It arrived via blinker-lamp from Keppel, our flotilla leader, at 0745 on July 4th. Intercom anomaly on Blackwood. SDOP trace source stop terminate. Immediately stop report compliance by 0900. My stomach dropped as if the ship had missed a wave. I read it twice, then folded the slip into my pocket, the paper crisp against my thigh like a guilty secret. The Admiral didn't care that her voice kept a boy from Manchester from screaming through his shattered femur, or that the burn victim from Glasgow finally slept when she hummed the refrain. To them, it was noise uncontrolled, unregulated. A vulnerability in the system. I climbed to the bridge under the pretense of checking antenna alignment, but my eyes kept drifting aft, toward the infirmary's porthole, half veiled by blackout curtains. Through a sliver of glass, I saw her silhouette cap askew, shoulders hunched over a cot just as she began again. "'Tis time it," was the Ashgrove, slow and mournful, each syllable weighted with something beyond duty. The wind carried a salt-laced hush across the decks, and for a moment even the sea seemed to listen. Back in the comms cabin, I sat before the master control panel, fingers hovering over the kill switch for Circuit 3B. My orders were clear. My conscience less so. I could hear the scrape of a metal bedpan, the wet cough of a pneumonia patient, the distant clang of a mess tin life persisting in the margins of war, and then her voice, rising like smoke from a dying fire. I closed my eyes. I didn't cut the line. Instead, I pressed my thumbs to my temples and began to memorize not just the tune, but the timbre, the imperfections, the way her voice cracked on the word grief, as if she'd lived it herself. I mapped it onto the neural pathways usually reserved for call signs and convoy coordinates. If they wanted silence, they'd get it soon enough, but not before I'd archived her in the only medium left unregulated, my mind. At 0858, I toggled the switch. The cabin emptied of music, leaving only the hollow hiss of dead air. I radioed Keppel. Anomaly resolved. Source neutralized. The reply came instantly. Acknowledge, well done. But nothing was resolved. Nothing was neutralized. That night, alone in my hammock swaying with the ship's uneasy gait, I began to hum, softly, so no one would hear, just the first phrase of All Through the Night. And as I did, I felt not heard her voice return, not through wires or speakers, but from some chamber deep within me, where certain things, once witnessed, refused to be unremembered. The war ended, but her song did not. It followed me ashore in 45, wrapped in the same salt-stiffened greatcoat I'd worn through the Barents Sea gales, clinging to the lining like a second skin. London in those first months was a city of gap-gaping windows, gaping silences, gaping absences where voices used to be and yet hers filled the hollows I had known. I'd walk past shattered shop fronts on Oxford Street, past queues for bread that stretched longer than any convoy, and in the pause between tram bells and air raid sirens, still tested weekly, just in case, I'd find myself humming under my breath, lips barely moving, as if the melody were contraband. I never learned what became of Eleanor Whit after PQ-17 scattered to the Admiralty, as catastrophic order to scatter and proceed independently. Turned 35 merchantmen into kindling for U-boat Wolfpack H. Blackwood limped into Reykjavik with a fractured rudder and a sickbay emptied by death or transfer. She was gone by then, reassigned to a field hospital near Murmansk, or so the surgeon muttered over a tin of bully beef. No forwarding address, no Red Cross tracing number. Just a name inked in the casualty log and the lingering scent of carbolic soap on the cot where she sat. Night after night, stitching wounds with thread and song alike. Back in civilian life, I took a job with the Post Office Telecommunications Directorate, splicing cables in telephone exchanges that still bore the soot scars of the Blitz. The work was quiet, methodical, a balm for a mind trained to listen for wolf tones and bearing drifts. But silence, I discovered, was not the absence of sound, it was a canvas. And on that canvas, her voice painted itself anew each evening. When the last relay clicked off and the switchboard lights dimmed to embers, I'd sit in my flat above a tobacconist in Islington, curtains drawn against the street lamp as a sodium glare, and reconstruct a performance note by note, phrase by phrase, as if transcribing a lost symphony from memory alone. I got it wrong. Of course, memory is a faulty recorder, prone to emphasis, to omission, to the softening of edge. But I got the feeling right. The way her voice held both sorrow and solace in the same breath, like two currents running beneath a single surface. I never sang aloud, not truly, not where others might hear. There was something almost sacrilegious about giving her song to the world award that had sent boys to freeze in Arctic waters, that had ordered me to erase her precisely because her humanity was inconvenient, so I kept it internal. A ritual of remembrance conducted in the cathedral of my own skull. Each night, I'd close my eyes, lean back in my threadbare armchair, and let the first notes rise from the diaphragm, silent but felt a vibration more than a sound. All through the night, the stars will shine. I'd shape the words with my tongue, taste the Welsh consonants like old copper coins, feel the resonance in my sternum. It was my penance and my prayer, both. Once, in 1953, I attended a memorial service at the Tower Hill Merchant Navy Memorial. Rain slicked the Portland stone, and the names of lost ships Don Witherspoon, Paulus Potter, Navarinoglimed, like wet ink. An elderly woman in a navy blue coat stood near the wreath laying, her hand trembling as she traced a name. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was Hertha set of the shoulders, the way she tucked a stray strand of gray hair behind her ear. But when she turned, her eyes were strangers. Still, I followed her to the tube station, not out of hope, but out of habita, reflex of a man who had spent years listening for a voice that might never return. Decades passed, the world rewired itself. Transistors replaced valves, satellites eclipsed Moors, and the very notion of a telegraph operator became a museum curiosity. I retired in '68, moved to a cottage in Dorset, where the only intercom was the wind through the gorse and the cry of gulls over Lyme Bay. And yet, every night without fail, I performed my silent Sometimes I'd stand at the window, watching the channel churn under moonlight, and imagine her voice carried on the same currents that once brought U-Boat reports crackling through my headphones. Other nights I'd sit by the hearth, logs hissing with sap, and let the melody coil around the embers like smoke. It wasn't until my 83rd year, 2005, a spring unseasonably warm, that I finally spoke her song aloud. My great-niece, Clara, a music student at King's, had come to visit, lugging a battered tape recorder for a project on oral history. She coaxed stories from me over tea ice in the mess tins, the ghostly green of Aztec screens, the way the sea could look black as ink under a full moon. Then, hesitantly, she asked, "Did anyone sing on the ship?" I didn't answer at first. The question hung in the air, like a held breath. Outside, a blackbird trilled in the hawthorn. I looked at her, young, earnest, fingers tapping nervously on the recorder end. Something in me unclenched. "Yes," I said. "Once, and then," voice thin but steady, I sang. Not will H had sanded the edges off my pitch, but with a precision born of 63 years of rehearsal. All through the night. "'Tis your dear form, I see." Clara didn't move. The recorder worked softly, capturing not just sound, but weight, history, the echo of a sick bee rocking on Arctic swells. When I finished, she was crying. Not dramatically, just a single tear tracking down her cheek, which she brushed away quickly, as if embarrassed. That's beautiful, Granddad," she whispered. "Who was she?" I told her everything I could remember. The name, the convoy, the order to silence her. But I didn't say what I knew in my bon's death. I hadn't preserver vorse out of nostalgia, but out of defiance. That some acts of erasure fail because the human mind is not a switchboard to be toggled, but a sanctuary where certain voices, once heard, become part of the architecture of the soul. Clara released the recording online years later, part of a documentary titled Voices from the Ice Convoys. It garnered modest attention enough for a few historians to write for a memorial plaque to be placed at the Imperial War Museum. But I never listened to it. I didn't need to. Her song was never in the wires or on the tape. It was here between the ribs, behind the eyes, in the quiet space where memory and music fuse into something eternal. Now, on nights when the pain in my hips is bearable and the morphine hasn't yet blurred the edges of the room, I still sing. Not for an audience, not for history, but because to stop would be to let the silence win on silence, in the end, is the only true enemy we never defeated.